So welcome everyone to our NEDTech session, which is on digital technologies and humanitarian settings. It's a pleasure to have such an experienced group of practitioners with us tonight, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about some of the initiatives that they're involved in humanitarian settings globally. So let me just go around and ask the panelists to introduce themselves. So Sofie, let's start with you.
Hi everyone, thanks Jane for inviting me to speak tonight. This morning, depending on where you are. I'm Sofie Blakstad. I'm the CEO of an impact fintech startup, hiveonline. We build community finance solutions for unbanked entrepreneurs in sub-Saharan Africa. And I also contribute to research promoting the advancement of fintech and particularly blockchain in sustainability and impact globally.
Thanks, Sofie, and we're really looking forward to hearing more about that. Ric, can I go to you, please?
Thanks, Jane. Happy to. Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Ric Shreeves, and I'm the Director of Emerging Technology for the NGO Mercy Corps. I'm based in Portland, Oregon, and my brief at Mercy Corps is to explore new and innovative uses of technology that may have applications for the agency, and then to spin up trials and proofs of concept of those tech. In that capacity, I've been involved with blockchain and crypto work at Mercy Corps for a couple of years now. Mercy Corps is also a member of the Libra Association, where I sit on the technical steering committee.
Thanks, Ric. Adam, welcome.
Thanks, Jane. Nice to be here today. Thanks for the invite. I lead the Innovative Finance and Systems Change team for the Danish Red Cross, and that team looks at ways to leverage technology, to think about risk transfer, essentially how to consider ways that improve the effectiveness and efficiency of humanitarian interventions. And it's pretty much a global platform, and we look at things from blockchain to insurance-linked securities, all the way to outcome funds and other types of mechanisms. So glad to be here. Thanks
so much, and welcome. And my co-host Helen Disney is also with us. So Helen, I'll ask you to introduce yourself because I'm sure you'll join in the discussion.
Sure, thanks Jane. I'm Helen Disney. I'm the CEO of UNBLOCKED, which is a platform for teaching senior executives about blockchain and distributed ledgers and how I believe they're going to make a fundamental impact on our world. And I'm particularly interested in how they can have an impact on humanitarian crises and develop solutions for social good. So I'm really excited to hear from everyone on this panel because I know some of the people, but not all of the people, and I really want to hear more about what they're doing.
Thank you. And Josh, from My Geography here in Australia, welcome. Please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Jane, and welcome everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Josh Hallwright. I'm the humanitarian lead at Oxfam Australia. I've been mucking around with blockchain technology at Oxfam for the last 3 years or so. But I'm slightly jealous of the other panelists in that it sounds like I'm the only one that does it off the side of my desk, and you've all got dedicated proper roles to do it. So looking forward to the discussion.
No, and we're certainly looking forward to hearing about the work that you've been doing. Thank you, and welcome. And just by way of introduction, one of the things that we've seen very vigorously has been a pivoting of technology to respond to COVID. And in a way, I see that as a kind of reflection of what's been happening in humanitarian, because humanitarian is one of the areas that has embraced digital perhaps much more quickly than other segments of government and international organisations. And we've seen a lot of different projects around the world in humanitarian settings, from remittances and payments, supply chain, credentialing, identity, and so forth. And so what I'm really excited about today is to hear from some of the people who are leading these projects on the ground. So perhaps I can start by asking Sofie, I know that you've been doing some research recently and looking at some of the constraints of the various technical options that are available and the different potentials for moving forward, particularly with blockchain and finance, and looking at areas around accountability, customer risk and financial risks that impact on NGOs. So we'd love to hear more about your work and hear some of your thoughts about those risks and constraints. Sofie.
Thanks, Jane. So yes, we've been conducting this research, in fact, with the active involvement of many of the people around this table. We've looked at all of the significant blockchain-based projects that have been run in the humanitarian sector over the last few years, as well as a wide variety of other actors in this space, including startups like mine and large technology companies. We've been looking at different blockchains, at different distributed ledger technologies, and how they could be applicable to the sector. And we've drawn some, I think, interesting conclusions about the evolution of these projects in the humanitarian sector. One key observation is that it's difficult for the humanitarian sector to start working with new technologies because the humanitarian sector is necessarily focused on interventions on the ground, in working very closely with people. And Josh mentioned he's been doing this off the side of his desk. Actually, people like Adam and Ric, who do have these official roles in NGOs, are quite rare. And the resources that they are able to use are quite small. So although many of these organizations are very large, their access to the necessary technical expertise is often down to individuals like Adam and Ric and Josh, just actually really getting fired up about technology and learning about it themselves, as really personal interest as much as anything else. So that, of course, leads to a lack of capacity in terms of technical capability within organizations, which I think has led to a slower development than you have seen in some other sectors, and particularly the commercial sector. And that's also led to the fact that there's a relatively narrow field of tool sets that are being used. And so, for example, a lot of the early projects were started on Ethereum, which is a perfectly good blockchain, but it's not necessarily very suitable for the sector because it's slow throughput, high cost, and of course it's proof of work, which is using a lot of energy. And I think last year it burned as much energy as Paraguay. So many of these early projects have been really, using, I think, probably what you call second generation rather than more modern technologies, which are now available. And the real challenge that they face, I think, also is the way that projects are funded, which means that it's very hard to operate across organizations. And while NGOs, of course, do collaborate, this technology gives huge opportunities to collaborate across the sector. And that doesn't work with the way that donor-funded projects run by the humanitarian sector work. So that's a big barrier that needs to be overcome. But you also referred to the regulatory challenges, and I think this is an interesting learning one for the sector, because of course, while the humanitarian sector has always dealt with moving money around, I mean, that's what they do, there is a subtle but important distinction between moving money around and managing a financial service. And of course, in the old world, using banks, the banks have risk controls and are responsible for managing customer data and obviously for managing the financial elements. Whereas, of course, blockchain, by its very nature, is not owned or controlled by anyone. So nobody is responsible for that regulation. And while blockchain assets, digital assets, are largely subject to regulations, so you have regulations in many, many territories, they're different in every territory. They're emerging very fast. Often regulators and governments don't really understand the technology either. And so what we're seeing is, and I think Josh will talk to this, an evolving understanding of regulation, both within the NGOs and within the governments that they're working with, to try and find solutions, and that's quite challenging as well. So we have seen a lot of barriers, but having said that, even though the early projects have not necessarily exploited all of the full benefits and the full opportunities that blockchain can give, one thing they've all shown is an opportunity to save a lot of cost, to take a lot of inefficiency and friction out of the value chains that they've been applied to. So even though I think the there is a huge missed opportunity in many of these projects. The baby steps that they've taken have actually demonstrated such great benefits already that taking the next step is necessarily going to be an even more systemic and systemically important transformation in cost reduction, increased transparency, all those things you said. So we're really looking forward to what's happening next.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. And I am interested in those two issues around multi-jurisdictional regulation, because obviously this applies to many other sectors as well. But the other point, and it'll be interesting to come back to it if we have time, is these different cost models of the donors versus the way the platforms are charging and so forth, and the lack of consistency or ability to be able to, make those two things work. So really appreciate those comments and look forward to some more discussion when we come back to it. So Ric, actually I first met you in 2017, so you've obviously been in the space more than a couple of years. I'd love to hear from you on how you see digital technologies in general developing, and stable coins in particular, and their impact on financial inclusion.
Sure, Jane. Yeah, I think we first met at an OECD blockchain conference, which was a great place to start. How do I view technology in general? Well, I mean, my job is really just sort of scan the horizon and look at things that we think have potential and get those into some sort of a trial stage. So I tend to be an optimist about the potential for impact of technology on the sector. And really, if you think about it, to me, it just makes plain sense. I mean, we work at these organizations, these NGOs, that are massively resource stretched, and we're confronting these global problems that are not getting smaller. In fact, just the opposite. And so we're forced really to do more with less, really. And so the ability to use technology in such a fashion that we can leverage our impact and expand our reach is a very compelling argument to me, and why I think that we need to try to stay more on our front foot instead of being reactive, which is typically the way NGOs have worked in the past. And for good reasons, like the business model things that Sophie flagged a second ago. NGOs are largely concerned with how do we deliver impact today to address the immediate needs that we're facing right now. And that means oftentimes it's hard to get that funding into a position where we can explore new technologies or unproven ways of working. So it's a real challenge with the actual business model that exists in the sector. The fact that I'm able to do what I do is largely a result of the fact that we have a particular donor who's incredibly generous with us and is very much forward thinking, and that's Cisco. We're also members of the Cello Alliance for Prosperity, with whom we're doing a trial in Kenya right now on micro work, using digital payments for micro work. Ripple, you may have just seen recently, granted Mercy Corps $10 million for financial inclusion, and we're conducting field trials around using stable coins and digital currencies as ways of improving financial inclusion. We're also looking at other digital modalities, whether it's microinsurance, parametrics, or creative types of financing for the sector. So we think there's a lot there, but finding the things that have a risk profile that's acceptable for the sort of vulnerable populations that we work with, and are things that our program people can design around because it's new and they don't really know how to design around it, remains a challenge. So that capacity building side of things is huge for us right now, and why we're trying to do things beyond just Mercy Corps, right? We're trying to do things that impact the sector as a whole and bring together people like Danish Red Cross and Oxfam around the table so we can have conversations about how can we as a sector do more, as opposed to how can Mercy Corps alone do more, right? Because we're all aligned in terms of our mission to address these incredibly urgent, in some cases, needs across the globe. So we need to be able to work together on that. And I do think that that's going to be the key, is collaborating more in the future. Now, to your second part of your question concerning stablecoins. Mercy Corps really does a lot of cash and voucher assistance. In fact, pretty much everybody in the sector does these days. And when we do cash and voucher assistance, things like the mobile money systems of Kenya, the M-Pesas of this world, have really changed the way that some of that occurs, and has made it more effective, made it easier to track and trace, and has really opened up new ways of working. We see stablecoins as something that holds a great deal of potential. Imagine, if you will, that we had a low volatility, low cost coin that was acceptable globally, right? How could that impact our work? And in many ways, it could impact our work, from everything from back office operations, us moving money into difficult places, to actually doing direct distributions to beneficiaries, to our program participants. There's a number of really compelling use cases for that technology. It's why we got involved as a founding member of the Libra Association. That was the first project we saw that we thought had the potential to achieve that goal of, a globally acceptable, low cost, high stability coin. Celo is another good example, and that's why we got involved with the Celo Alliance for Prosperity. Of course, the rise of central bank digital currencies is of a great deal of interest to us right now. We do, for example, operate in the Bahamas. And with the launch of the sand dollar, the first central bank digital currency in Bahamas, we've been looking at how that could impact our programming. Imagine, if you will, and this isn't much of a stretch, that Bahamas is hit by a hurricane, right? Well, one of the first things that comes back online is the cell network, primarily because of the location of Bahamas and easy access to that kind of technology. And now with the sand dollar, all the Bahamian citizens, they have digital wallets on their phones. Well, if we need to do direct assistance, we can do direct assistance using a digital currency now instead of doing a physical or manual distribution. So that's just a simple example that shows how in one case we can use that tech. And we see a number of use cases in this field. I think I'm going to stop there because I think I've just burned up my 5 minutes.
No, but it's really super interesting. And I think that issue of digital payments in humanitarian disasters is incredibly important. And we've certainly seen the acceleration of digital payments during the pandemic as well. And I know that Josh is going to talk about that, and probably Adam. So Adam, I'd really like to hear more about the Red Cross Innovation and Finance Systems, and just also to all of you to see this kind of collaboration going across the NGOs, as you all are, I think is really encouraging for all of us for the future, to be able to collaborate to build a system that works for everyone. So thank you all for that. And Adam, I'd love to hear some more about some of the exciting things that the Red Cross is doing.
Great, well, thanks, Jane. The interesting bit is that the innovative finance team within the Danish Red Cross is leading a lot of the innovation in the tech space. And part of the reason why is because when we think about innovative financing, we think about that as a wrapper, not really as the core functional tool or the solution. And I think that's a little different than a lot of the other teams that are focused on innovative financing. And the reason why I say that is that when we look at how we can have a big impact on the ground, and I think Rick and Sofie have done a really good job of kind of laying down the groundwork for a lot of the stuff that we also believe around being able to lower the cost of transactions. And the Red Cross does about $1 billion a year in cash transfer. And after the UN, it's probably the largest organization that does that. And so a good portion of our cash in disaster assistance goes towards cash. But what we wanted to challenge was not just getting the cash to the ground, but also to be able to create a platform that was a response and a recovery and a resilience, so that we could toggle between different events pretty quickly. And I think that during COVID in March, it was really clear to us that the communities that we work with on the ground, that they had issues like physical health, mental health, liquidity problems, all those issues that come with some kind of pandemic. And so what we wanted to do was to be able to move from a community inclusion currency platform, which we've been working with grassroots economics for the last, I would say, like 18 months, to turn that into a response. And that took us about 1 day. And what was really helpful, and I think Rick, highlighted this, is that we had a combination of about 45,000 families in Kenya, which equivalent to over 200,000 individuals, on the back of having the 60,000 Red Cross volunteers in the ground, or on the ground rather, who are community health workers and can service these communities in places that others can't because of the social distancing. And so once you take the ability to access the individuals on the ground with the technology that allows us to transfer funding, and then not just transfer it, but also track it. And that's where the blockchain for us comes into, that we can quickly validate the different transactions. And so we're able to pinpoint exactly which communities need support. And so, for example, before the crisis of COVID started, the majority of people were using these tokens that we work with for savings groups. And after then after we started focusing more on COVID response, we saw 110% increase in food and water. And then we saw 110% increase in soap and other sanitation devices. And so then once we start to get that information in, we can do some predictive analytics so that our community health workers on the ground can see exactly what's working and what's not working. And then the next layer after that, where we're transitioning into now, is to think about machine learning and AI, so that eventually we can take this combination of a kind of real-time streaming data, put it through some systems, come up with some predictive analytics, and then stream in different types of funding that are parametric based. For example, trigger based. So if we see X community go here, we can give more funding. And then to be able to create a system that comes up with different types of interventions that would impact those individual communities. And so we're taking what we're doing, for example, with a volcano catastrophe bond, which is on a platform which is a multi-hazard risk engine that we're rolling out now in 10 different countries around, or 10 different locations in the world, to take that concept of trigger-based financing, marry it with blockchain and sort of community currencies, and then figure out how to kind of scale that up. Now, the project that we're working on together with Rick and Sofie is to figure out, how to come up with a solution which could be a blockchain or a distributed ledger, which doesn't actually follow the traditional trend of like a POS or a proof of authority, something that's a do no harm, as I call it in my simple mind. But essentially it's a place where it's a safe space for organizations like the Red Cross to operate to scale and not worry about gas or ICOs or things of that nature, where it has a very solid governance structure and is also in the basis of that has the scalability, but can work on digital ID, can work on transfer of funds, can think about what a scalable token or stable coin could look like. So yeah, I'll end there, but that's kind of what the philosophy is.
And look, I think that's the holy grail for all of us who have been supporters of blockchain and social impact. So it's tremendous to hear about the work you're doing. But let me just do a quick follow-up, because, the kinds of communities that you're working with, and maybe this is something we can all discuss, is around, ethics and technology, ethics and ID, informed consent, and those kinds of things. So I don't know if you want to make a comment on that, but I would be keen to get other people's points of views on this as we are rolling out these technology into often disadvantaged and illiterate communities.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Red Cross starting point is do no harm, right? That's just our ethos. And once we build off of that, we think about how to get people into these systems so that they have the ability to opt in. And so when we work with the communities, and we start from the village chief and work our way down, and it's a collective decision by the community to join these savings groups and these kind of tokenized collectives. The decision is on their hands to basically opt in. And they opt in. There's 3 different levels of KYC. There's just like the basic user who comes in and says, yes, I agree. Then there's another level of identification where they provide a bit more information of who they are. And then if you're like a heavy vendor, then there's another sort of validation portion of it. So our wallets that we use are custodial. They're non-custodial. They're not the sort of like independent that we think about in the pure blockchain space, because it's just not viable at this point. But what I can say is that the way we store the data is very different than traditionally how humanitarian organizations do, which is on a spreadsheet, right? In some cases, maybe they lock it up in a single server. So we're moving more to a distributed net. But eventually what our idea, and I can't speak for the entire Red Cross, I can talk for what our team is to think about data co-ops and data communities, where the individual communities owning that data, they make the decisions in terms of how they want to use it and how to monetize it if they so choose. But I don't think really, even in the United States, I don't feel like we're at that point of self-sovereign ID, and maybe people don't even want that. But it's a major concern. It's something that we look at. And I would say one last thing is that we're also working through compliance right now, where we work with a local law firm to make sure that we're up to speed and that we're compliant with the local regulations.
Terrific. Thank you very much. And then I'd like to move now to Josh to talk about some of the work that Oxfam's been doing. The one that I'm familiar with, of course, is the SEMPO in Vanuatu, but I'd love to hear about the work that you guys are doing.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks, colleagues, for your thoughts so far. And I guess to start with, I'd be really keen to continue these conversations and to put into place more of that collaboration, because one of the things that we've found, or I've certainly found, is over the last 3 or 4 years, it is quite difficult to have a resource for the sector to do the coordination and collaboration solely as their function. So I think that, you know, the OCHA of the blockchain world in some ways. So that could be something to take forward. Oxfam's been exploring blockchain in maybe 4 main different use cases. One's around self-sovereign ID. One's around the supply chains. Another is around different types of fundraising. And the last, which I think most people are more familiar with, is the cash and voucher assistance work in Vanuatu that we've been doing with a local startup or an Australian-based startup, and then working with colleagues in Vanuatu. So in that particular case, one of the things that's come to the fore, and without sort of diving into the technology too much, one of the things that I found really interesting is the responsiveness of design that we've been able to do by literally sitting down with the software developers and the startup, literally sitting down with the vendors and the community then and there and saying, well, this isn't working for me, or I don't like how this works, or whatever it is, and literally changing the code, responsive design there and then, and addressing those issues. So it's been fascinating to be able to have to bring into the tech space a lot of the approaches to the work that we do from the humanitarian sector, you know, participatory design, community-led development, etc., and put those in practice into the development of the technology. And I think it's one of the first times we've seen that with advanced technology, where there's been a real marrying of the social sector and the tech sector. The other thing that I found really fascinating through this work, so effectively what it is using blockchain technology. It's on the Ethereum mainnet to create digital assets that are used to provide cash assistance to disaster response in Vanuatu. Currently what we're doing is moving that into more the COVID-19 response. So similar to Adam, one of the things I think is an important reflection for the entire sector, not just tech in the sector, is I think if we start to think of humanitarian as a context in which we work, some of these, you know, the nexus conversations and some of the ways in which we can use the technology in various different settings becomes much easier. So for example, in Vanuatu, we've been doing a lot of preparedness work with blockchain and sort of laying the groundwork for it all, setting up the infrastructure. In the response phases with the volcano in the north, for example, and now with COVID and TC Harold earlier in the year, we've literally used it as a cash dispersal, cash distribution network. And now that it's starting to get into the recovery space, we're having conversations with various different line ministries around using the same platform for effectively a social protection, social welfare system, and integrating that with some of the financial inclusion initiatives. And so that brings me perhaps to my last point before we get into the discussion, because I feel like we've got lots to talk about, is again on the social sector, or humanitarian sector, and the technology sector working hand in glove. One of the things that's come to the fore for us in all of those different use cases is the value. I think Oxfam and broader in the sector, we're starting to see a shift in how we understand the value we provide. To Ric's point before, we're doing less and less direct delivery, but we still have a whole bunch of value in how we do the work. It just looks different. So what I mean by that is, there's a lot of hype, especially a couple of years ago, around blockchain being the disintermediation in the humanitarian sector. So we can just get rid of NGOs or UN agencies and provide money in this place and get money to that place, and khalas, we're sorted. But one of the things that we've found in practice by doing all of this is that NGOs like Oxfam have a huge amount of expertise and experience and skills to bring to the fore in regulatory challenges. Sofie mentioned before, one of the things we've done in Vanuatu is change the national legislation around the acceptable use of cryptocurrencies in that country. A lot of the relationship work, the dialogue with communities, authorities, lawmakers, ministries, the coordination, the human part of HCI, the human part of human computer interaction, I think is something that we've done well, with some bumps along the way, and that's something that we've found. The technology and the product itself is maybe 20% of the impact, and the 80% is everything that makes that product able to work in that particular context. I think sometimes we have a tendency to forget that we need both. I might leave it there. Ta.
No, thanks, Josh. And I mean, that's certainly been a conversation going around, particularly in relation to transmission and management of funding, because a lot of NGOs, have quite a proportion of their work which is simply made up of that. So it would be interesting to have some perspectives from other people on the panel about how technology will change the role of NGOs and the way NGOs do business. So I'd like to maybe go back, Sofie, to you, because we've heard that the key use cases seem to be around payments, identity, supply chain, and fundraising. Clearly, everyone thinks there's a huge role for collaboration. There's some hurdles ahead of us in terms of regulation and making space and time for that collaboration and the way that donors fund. So, Sofie, I'd love you to just maybe proposition where you see the role of NGOs is going to go, and how a kind of shared technology platform for humanitarian NGOs will change the way they do business.
Thanks, Jane. Well, as Josh said, clearly humanitarian organisations have a critical role to play in interventions, and particularly on the human side. I cannot see a world where humanitarian organisations are completely disintermediated, because, one of the key challenges in working with vulnerable populations is that you're dealing with people, and people who are traumatised and have suffered and need support and succour on the ground. So that's never going to go away. What I do see is a big transformation in certain areas. And you mentioned both payments and donor funding. We've seen some interesting examples. Obviously, Oxfam is one of them, where traceability of donor funds has been achieved through blockchain, and that has reduced a lot of friction and increased efficiency, and also increased the amount of the donation that goes to the intervention, which I think is a really critical part of it. And that efficiency can be seen in really any type of payments flow, where we have both the opportunity to trace the use of funds all the way through to the beneficiary, which I think is really, really critical, and then to demonstrate proof of impact in a way that is generally done after the fact, very expensively through audits and without necessarily the full confidence, especially in places where there are challenges. So I think that the efficiency of movement of value will be a huge piece. When we think that 17% of NGO funding goes to CVA, cash and voucher assistance today, if we could cut out the cost of moving money around for that's going to be massive. But the other area, I think, where it's going to be really transformational for the sector, and again, like Rick, I'm an optimist here, is bringing the sector together in the certification piece. And, you know, this could be self-sovereign identity, it could be certification of the movement of goods and services, you know, slavery-free diamonds, tuna that's line caught and not trawled. That, you know, those aren't necessarily humanitarian as such, but there are elements of humanitarian in there. And what I would love to see as a result of this project and as a result of the sector coming together is vulnerable individuals being able to control their identities and their certifications, and being able to use those identities and certifications for non-humanitarian real-world scenarios. So if I get an identity from Mercy Corps because I've been a vulnerable person in a disaster situation, you know, I can use that identity, I can use that reputation, I can use that certification, and I can go and open a bank account with it, and then I can go and get a job with it, and then I can buy a house with it. And, you know, all of these things that I think we've, you know, the fragmentation of the projects means that there is no sort of persistent use for these identities beyond the immediate need. And actually the next stage is to not only use those identities and certifications across multi-agencies, but actually just persist and use them for the rest of your life, so that, you know, you have that identity. And I agree that self-sovereign identity is, you know, we're a long way off, but it, you know, it has to happen. And you know, an example I always use is, how many copies of your passport do you think there are out there? How many hotels have got photographs of your passport? I have no idea. And the loss of data, the leakage of data, the inefficiency is just appalling when you think about it like that. And this technology offers an opportunity to make people's lives easier, not just when they need immediate disaster relief, but for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. And you know, I think that that's an aspiration that many people have, but we do have challenges with the, you know, acceptability by various agencies of that identity. So how we can kind of build the value in those digital identities to be accepted by multiple agents is going to be a real challenge. So Ric, let me come to you, because you know, you're working with some big players, looking at huge scale. What's your vision for where this can all go?
Where to begin? On the crypto philanthropy and NGO business model side of things, I think there's a number of really interesting things that are happening, some of which you guys have alluded to and Josh touched on as well. Whether it's direct giving models, whether it's things like the Oxchain project that Oxfam worked with, where a donor is able to select the recipients and the conditions upon which their donation will be used. We've seen tremendous growth in Give Directly, the organization Give Directly, across the last decade. I think they've delivered now more than 300 million in aid, so they're really starting to come into their own. And then we've seen other really, you know, innovative approaches like the distributed altruism approach of the Alice Project, right? Which of those are going to stick? Which ones are going to change the way that NGOs have to change their operation? And I think the underlying, or I should say the common theme of all those things, is that through the use of distributed ledger technology and digital identity and digital tokens, we're able to give more transparency in what happens with donations and how funds are used and who exactly they helped. And I think that's going to have a significant impact on NGO operations. The question is, are NGOs going to get on, the traditional NGOs, are they going to get on the front end of that and leverage it to their advantage, or are they merely going to react to it when they realize it's a threat to their business model? So the jury's still out on that one, but it's a very, very interesting space to watch right now. I think that the digital identity situation, you know, I always call it a quagmire, because there are so many players out there and there's so many standards. And Jane, you just touched on one of the big issues, which is how do we get a state actor to recognize an ID issued by a third party non-state actor? You know, there's so many complications in that field, but we've got to crack it, because digital ID is atomic to all of these solutions. And what I mean by that is it's an absolute necessary building block, whether it's the program participants having an ID or whether it's the NGO having the credentials that allows them to interact with the distributed ledger, right? So it's a problem that has to be solved. I think that looking forward in terms of how it would impact direct operations and programming, then we're talking really about how digital tools can allow us to be more efficient and effective in our work and decrease costs of things like audits and monitoring and evaluation programs, which is one of the areas where we've seen a big upside to the use of distributed ledger tech. I was just talking to Simpo, which is one of the vendors that Oxfam works with and Danish Red Cross has experience with the other day. And they're hoping that their SOC 2 certification is coming out soon. And of course, when that sort of thing happens, it has a direct impact on reconciliation costs and audit costs for NGOs, which are really significant. You know, we're held very high audit standards by our donors, and rightfully so. So anything we can do to lower those costs and put more money towards the mission is super important and holds a ton of potential, in my opinion. And those, to me, are the top issues. There's a whole bunch of other ancillary stuff, but those are the biggies.
That's an important point that I just want to highlight, which is, you know, depending on whose estimate, that between 10 and 30% of funds are either wasted or inefficiently used. And if this can actually put that money back into the pot for use with beneficiaries, then that's a huge, huge benefit. So thanks for that. And let me now move on to Adam, you know, in terms of the Danish Red Cross and how far you think this can go, because obviously we have the promise of technology, we have the promise of blockchain, you know, for transferring funds, for doing identity, for bringing financial inclusion, and for measuring impact. You know, how far can we take this and this collaboration that you've got? How much chance do you think there is of broadening that across a much wider group of the NGO community and also getting governments on board so all of this can, as Sofie said, be like an identity and a trajectory for life?
I think it's a good question, because inherently in that question, you have to assume that not all actors or beneficiaries or players are in the same kind of like state recognized condition. For example, internally displaced individuals might be in one half of the world, and within their communities and within their country, they might be recognized but not have the same services, whereas refugees may not have any services whatsoever and have no recognition. So when we think about like scale and how far this can go, it's really in some ways a layered approach. And so we have to think about, one, with ID, if you're working with individuals who are refugees, you have to protect who they are, right? And there's a whole different layer and infrastructure that would support that versus, for example, individuals in Denmark who, you know, are still part of the Red Cross and in that community there could suffer from storm surge or volcanic eruption in Europe somewhere with Mount Etna. So I think where it can go depends really on the location. And so the way we look at it, at least from our team, is eventually we think that humanitarian assistance can actually be put into a box. And I think I've said this a few times, and I probably scare a few people, but I do think that there are certain functions with the right data, the right validation, that you can automate a lot of the things that we do today and put the control and the agency back into the hands of the community. The Red Cross itself is a volunteer network. We have 14 million people around the world. We can leverage that by having these like individuals living in these communities and operating and supporting. So we have to find ways to make them independent contractors in some ways so that we can leverage. I don't think the pot of cash is going to change. I think it's going to stay still. And so what we try to do is take our cash transfer, for example, take a fraction of that, put that into a reserve, whether it's a stable coin or another type of reserve, and provide some kind of multiplier effect to that. So we look not to do one for one. We try to use some kind of leverage, which we can actually find some kind of benefit from. So in terms of where this all goes, from a like first world perspective, the global north, you know, it's going to go in a different way than it is in the south. And in the south, it may take longer, but we can actually leapfrog. And I think you know, Josh and Sofie and Ric have given some examples of that. I'll just, for example, I'll say one last thing, that, for example, in Kenya, you know, we have this platform that we've been working on with grassroots, and, you know, we're in the process of seeing how that interacts with the social safety net there. from a resilience perspective, right? And I think that's how we integrate these into the systems where they become ubiquitous.
Thanks. And then Josh, let me come back to you. You know, at the moment, as you say, you're working part-time off the side of your desk. How do you see this moving forward, and what's your hope for the future?
I think just to, if I may be so bold as to quickly just touch on a couple of things that I've already raised and then return to that point, because I think one of the two interesting things that have happened recently with the work that we're doing, one with Vanuatu and one on the Trust Alliance, the identity management piece. The Vanuatu case, we are seeing that, like, we've literally had 2 weeks ago, one of the ministries that does the like the social welfare side of things, they have identity cards to manage, to provide support to people living with disabilities across Vanuatu. And part of that is to the people with disabilities, they have the identity card, and then the government is supposed to send people out to provide disability support to people. Oftentimes that doesn't happen. And so the ministries come to us to say, your identity card for the cash project, can we effectively use that as a credentialing one? Can we copy that card so it's the same card for one individual and have it as... Morning, darling.
It's very cute. Okay.
Copy that so that the person with the disability can verify the visit from the government employee to provide the services using a cash and voucher assistance identity. So it's already starting to happen in some cases. And I think that is a demonstration of my earlier point around the importance of relationships and how NGOs can still play in that space. In some ways, a different version of that is the self-sovereign identity piece that we've been doing with the Australian Red Cross and others to try and say, what's the different, like to somebody's point earlier, how do we get the acceptability of that identity across various different agencies? And so I was on a call yesterday with Australian Red Cross, Oxfam, one of the big universities here, the government, the Australian government agency that provides welfare payments, and a couple of others, to say, how do we agree on what's an acceptable identity and with credentials, and to pass that through to, with the understanding that it's the relationship side of things. So there's hope. And I think, like, for me, in the future, or in the near future, and we're already starting to see this, I think if you think of a table, we're still in the transactional piece in a large part for the technology, the transactional uses, getting efficiency dividends, creating a bit more transparency, etc. And I think we're going to move more into the transformational space, where we really start to get at the deeper issues that underline why the system doesn't work as it does currently, like power, inequities, injustices, etc., and use the technology to start to address some of that. So I think that currently, to Adam's point, we aren't really seeing much new money come into the system. Perhaps, Rick, with the crypto philanthropy, there is a little bit of new money, but some of the innovative financial products. I'm doing my PhD in humanitarian finance, so it's also of interest to me. Some of the innovative financial products, like the catastrophe bonds, are actually not new money. It's just a fancy way of sharing risk. And so I think what we will see is that transformation into rejigging and reorientating the whole humanitarian system to bring in different actors using this technology and the technology's transparency functions and the ability to have so many different multiple stakeholders using the same system or collaborating in the same way very, very cheaply and very easily. So I think it's really exciting. I think we're in I said to somebody recently, I think the NGO sector is in a state of transition, in a state of flux. over the next sort of 5 to 10 years. And to Ric's point earlier, I think, hopefully our organizations continue, and a few others that have realized what needs to change. And then we'll sort of bed down in the next 10 years of that sort of new world.
Oh, thanks. And I'd love to continue that conversation offline. But Sofie, I can see you've got your hand up. We're also starting to run out of time. So I wonder if you can both raise the issue that you'd like to, but also maybe make some summative remarks, just where this is going and what we all need to be paying attention to try and influence governments and donors and others to be supporting moving this in that forward direction that you envisioned before.
Thanks, Jane. Yes, and I really just wanted to build on one of the points that Josh just raised about governments starting to embrace identity when they see a good one. Because we've had the same experience with our digital reputation, because we're giving, or rather we're triangulating information about people who have no reliable identity data. They don't know how old they are, they don't have an address. So actually the lenders that we've been working with in Niger, where most people have no access to financial services or formal identity, they look at our reputation, which is based on blockchain-based data, and say this is much better than what the government has, and therefore, let's have a conversation with the regulators. So, like Josh, we're starting to see this, and I think that there are places which have really strong government identity systems where that won't be relevant, at least not yet. But I think some of the more frontier places definitely will. In terms of where I see this going, I agree with Josh, the sector is transforming already, and I think we're seeing a lot more market-based interventions. Obviously, we are supporting communities in building wealth, and that's what our community finance platform is for. And we're seeing more and more convergence between what we think of as traditional donor-funded projects and market-based interventions. And I believe that this technology is going to accelerate that trend because it improves traceability, it improves resilience, and it also enables communities to build wealth without necessarily having a financial institution involved directly. So I think there's a very bright future for this.
Yeah, thanks, Sofie. Ric, can we just reach out to you for some closing remarks?
Yeah, happy to. One of the things I wanted to flag was something that Josh raised, which is the role that we should all be taking in policy and advocacy around these topics. Say what you will about Libra, one of the things that it has done is it's made the regulators take seriously the stablecoin space, right? They look at it and they see the first project that has the potential to scale, and so they want to get involved now. And we need to make sure, and I'm sorry, you're going to hear some noise in the background. I've just had a workman show up here at the house. Timing is just perfect. One of the things that we all need to strive towards is making sure that we see that tech developed in an ethical fashion. And that's something where we can have a meaningful voice in that dialogue. And I'm going to mute right now because it's about to get very barky here.
Okay, that sounds like Ric's gone. I'm getting in a noisy space as well, but let's just bring this home strongly. So Adam, what do we need to be focusing on? I do want to emphasize that advocacy side of it, because I still think there's a huge kind of education, envisioning advocacy component for us with the international organizations and governments. So Adam, what do you see we need to be doing, and where is this all going? And any last comments for the audience?
Sure. Just I guess as a summary, humanitarian organizations are still in that flux between development and humanitarian response. And as they try and get closer to that kind of the middle, so do the different types of systems. But we have issues like around how to do procurement, how to have contracts, how to actually engage private sector, how to have these type of transformational partnerships. And so what we can do is we can create this kind of low bono environment where we have this hybrid approach to financing things and using technology as a way to get there. But if COVID has showed us anything, this kind of fintech world that we're all living in now is really becoming dominant. And if you could just look at Ant Group that just went IPO'd in Hong Kong at like 36 billion, that's now larger than Bank of America. So the Googles of the world and the Facebook of the world are now perhaps taking the second stage where you start to see the next generation of technology organizations, which to Sophie's points brings out, pulls the banks out of the equation And what's left is basically the communities. And I think the Red Cross, for example, has a very strong footprint there because we are a volunteer-based environment. So our solutions need to be community-based, need to have a lot of agency, so individuals can operate these things themselves, and the Red Cross becomes a convening entity.
Yeah, interesting. Let me move on to Josh for your closing remarks. And Helen, I'll give you a chance at the end too, because I know that you've been listening to this fascinating conversation and you might have a few thoughts for us as well. So Josh, let me go to you.
Thanks, and perfect timing because the jug just finished boiling.
Okay. Well,
yeah, I think that Adam's point around the convening is exactly where things are heading, and I think that that's really exciting. Oxfam's talked about ourselves as sort of broker, facilitator, convener for a while now, and now we're moving to a diversified network as an organizational design principle. So engaging much more with partners and non-traditional partners as well, and I think that's where we're going to see the transformational change. So that's where we're going to be able to use coalitions and networks, to Helen's point, coalitions and networks to achieve those advocacy wins and those policy changes that will enable the technology to meet some of the promise that it's come up with. I think there's still a lot of issues that the humanitarian sector and the NGO space need to work with internally. It's a different way of thinking about development and humanitarian work, and that's challenging not only from an attitudinal behavior piece. It's still a challenge to move people from Bitcoin to distributed ledger technologies and those conversations from boards and executives down. But it's also a challenge in the types of partnerships, the types of agreements, the types of bank accounts we use, etc. So there's a lot that needs to shift, but I think on balance we're starting to see some the impact, the real world impact of the technology in the humanitarian space through various different organizations, pilot cases, and trying to get some of those successful ones to scale. And that is a massive improvement on 3 years ago. And so I'm really excited to see what the next 3 years can bring.
Look, I think it is exciting to see, despite the hype of 3 years ago, how much really great solid work's been done. So Helen, let me give you the floor for a moment to make any summative comments that you've got, and then we'll thank the panel very much for a conversation that I hope we can keep on going for a long time. Helen.
Well, first of all, thank you at the beginning, because I essentially had to make up my own job in order to work on blockchain and distributed ledgers full time. So you could always do that if you get tired of doing it from the side of your desk. But I think there's two aspects to it now. We're going to have more humanitarian crisis, sadly, as a result of COVID, and we're also going to have less money. So now is the moment to really use tech to prove how we can deliver these goals more cheaply. And I think the two kind of aspects where I can see the needle moving is, one, what you were talking about specifically about working with policymakers in countries where you've got an on-the-ground project and you can really show them, look, there's a need, there's a goal that we want to achieve, but we need you to understand what this is so that we can change the policy framework. And I work on a project called GovChain, where we look at how blockchain and distributed ledgers are being applied in different countries and which ones are doing well and which ones are not, and what the policymakers' challenges are. And I think that's a classic example where if you actually start working with people around a real thing that's happening, you can really make big differences. And then other countries get really encouraged and say, well, look, it's been done in Vanuatu, or it's been done in Dubai, or it's been done wherever. Okay, we can do it as well. So I see that as hugely encouraging. I think the other part is we probably do need more collaborative working, because, in the other sectors, like I mentioned in the chat, pharma, trade finance, to some extent banking, a lot of the work on ID and standards and sort of the policy framework has been done by companies coming together. And I think the same could be done on the humanitarian side. There are so many organizations, kind of intergovernmental organizations, that keep on looking at blockchain. We've had World Bank, we've had, WEF, we've had, the OECD meeting where I think you met Rick. You know, we've had all these kind of organizations, but they don't really talk to each other. So I think we do need more of that kind of collaborative approach to essentially not stop having the same conversation in 6 or 7 different forums and have one big conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. And so, I think I can sum that up. We need a big vision. We need a lot more collaboration, and we absolutely need the work of people like you all on the ground, showing us what works, what doesn't work, and why, so we're building out to a better future. So let me thank all of you for an absolutely fascinating conversation. Let me thank the NED for hosting this. This will be available on the NED site within about a week. So thank you, everyone.